what seems to be two types of issues that we were talking about, right? One is that the technology design itself might mandate certain relationships, right? So here we look, winner gives the case of nuclear power, right? Or which basically mandates hierarchical management, right? Similarly, Plato brings up how to govern ships, right? Where again it needs a hierarchical management, right? So in these setups, it's not that you can have some kind of a democratic angle that somebody is saying something, somebody is saying something else, and then you try to aggregate opinions of everybody. Here, the whole point is that opinions are not important, right? Rather, it is very factual. You need somebody to take, right? Wherever there is ambiguity, you need somebody to take a decision, and then everybody implements those decisions, right? So the nature of the technology itself mandates certain kinds of hierarchical arrangements, right? The other thing we saw is also that now we can debate, right, whether these are two different things or probably the same thing, right? But largely it seems that there's another aspect that the technology also influences the relationships among people. It directly or indirectly involves, right? So it's not just about managing a particular technology like over here, but also, right, you're imposing a technology where earlier different sets of users had different kinds of interactions, right? So here you talk about, like in the case of these bridges, right, between blacks and whites, or in the case of workers, right, between workers and management, right? But now when you impose the technology, then the technology has the capability of changing these relationships, right? That the technology is now imposing certain restrictions, right? Certain constraints on one class, one race, or in this case, over a class, right? Over the workers. We saw that Braverman essentially brought up similar things, right? That, so because it raises the question that, okay, given that technology can impose certain relationships or it can cause certain relationships to change in some ways, yeah, right? Why is it happening, right? So this is where Marxist critical thinking methods, and which people like Braverman have followed, right? That's where it comes in, that the technology design, right? What is driving all this, right? It's driven by an agenda of de-skilling, right, to reduce labor costs. That the more you deconstruct a job into smaller and smaller components, it will lower your cost to do those operations, because then you need less skilled labor to do many small tasks, as opposed of a more skilled labor to do many things, right. Similarly, it makes it easier to impose management control, because the only way in which you can deconstruct things into smaller and smaller things is at that point you will need a coordinator. Now, a machine could coordinate, which is where computerization comes in. And in this case, you're putting more power in the hands of the machine or the designers, the people who are making these machines, because you're extracting knowledge away from skilled machinists and you're encoding the knowledge into a program. Yeah. So that's management, right? So you're putting that, and therefore ultimately you're eliminating skilled machinists. You're basically bringing about a polarization of skills, that on the one hand you have a lot of unskilled laborers who are just doing these small simple tasks, and on the other hand you have even more highly skilled programmers, right, who have somehow managed to extract the knowledge from the domain experts. Who are the domain experts? The machinists. So they've extracted knowledge away from the domain experts and they have coded that knowledge into a program, and that program is now doing the rest of the work, right? Now you can basically extend this to, right, artificial intelligence or anything, right? Because ultimately, right, that's sort of what many of these technologies are doing, right? That if you look at health, for example, or you look at things like, you hear these phrases of data driven policy making, right? So now today it would be experts who are poring over data sets, who are poring over, right, decisions and figuring out, right, what's the right thing to do. But the machine is sort of taking that agency away. It's taking that knowledge and encoding it into a program. Right? Now the program could actually be a rules-based program, or it could be a machine learned program, right? But ultimately it's a program, it's a set of rules, right? How those rules are developed, whether those rules are explainable, right? That's what we saw in the previous case. Now some of those things can help make these technologies more acceptable, right? So that's right. So we know that debate, right? We've discussed that in the previous classes, right? But ultimately that's the whole idea, right? So what we're essentially talking about is that when the technologies are brought in, so far as part of user interfaces and data and privacy and algorithms, we were basically looking at just the technology itself, how we could change the technology to make it more acceptable and make it more, right, less discriminatory and so on, right? When we talk about system design, we're actually saying that the technology is actually changing social relationships itself, right? And now that could be due to certain reasons, right? But the fact is that it can, and it is, right? That's what Langdon Winners, right? His answer, right? The title of the paper is "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" But the answer is right, like a resounding yes, 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 yes. They do, right? You are encoding politics in the technology. These politics are actually changing relationships between people. Yeah. So that's Winners, right? Main argument over here. Then you can start thinking why it is happening, right? Why is certain technology, why are certain technologies being built? Because then you can look at it critically, right? That okay, these technologies are being built for a particular purpose, right? You're encoding politics, you're encoding a particular type of politics of manager control, for example, or de-skilling, cost reduction. So then you start thinking about those aspects. That why are these things being done, right? Who is allowing them to be done? So we'll discuss all of that as part of this particular module, right? Because and later on we will revisit, right? Because when we talk about political economy, then we will talk about, right, what is this political economy that we're living in, where managerial control is considered to be important, where cost reduction is considered to be important, right? So that's where we talk about capitalism, right? We can contrast that with other alternatives, right? Communism that could possibly exist. Yeah. Right. So it's about situating technology in that much broader context. Yeah. And then there were several examples, right? Harvesting of tomato, accessibility for the disabled. Yeah. And then Winner wasn't the only one, right? Louis Mumford was another very considered as a very great theoretician who did all this. And then there's many names like that. Like there's Jacques Ellul. We'll bring up other names like Ivan Illich. So all of them basically theorized some of these aspects and documented, right, with evidence of what was happening. Right, so Mumford talks about the distinction between what he calls authoritarian and democratic techniques. Authoritarian, sort of like the nuclear power that we were talking about, or ships that we were talking about, right? That certain technologies, right, they need large-scale organization, right? And they end up being, they therefore end up imposing authoritative structures, right? And once you have authoritative technology, then it means that there's more coercion, right? You then need people to do what you want them to do, right? Not what they would do otherwise, right? Even things like forced labor, slavery, right? So you can look at it in a much broader context as well. Yeah. So as opposed to certain technologies that would be more democratic, where the control of what the technology is or how it operates is not in the hands of one entity or like in a hierarchical management aspect, right? But it is more distributed. Yeah. Right. So let's start thinking. Let's start thinking also of examples, because that's one of the main gaps in all of this line of thinking, that there's been a lot of criticism, right? There's been a lot of criticism of how technology should actually be built, right? That authoritarian techniques can lead to coercion and all of these aspects, right? So that's right. You can now go back to so many of these ethical theories that we've seen, right? That it reduces liberty, right? Which Rawls talks about. It leads to inequality. You can look at it from Kant's categorical imperative point of view, that would you like to impose control over others, right? Universalize this rule. And right, so you can look at it from many, and obviously it is objectionable, right? Consequentialist theory would probably say that, well, this is a better method than others, right? If you have a democratic system, maybe it will not lead to. So remember, what is consequentialism trying to do? Utilitarianism, it is trying to maximize social welfare, right? So one important point is that we saw one of the gaps over there is how do you define social welfare? Yeah. So how do you define this greater good? And we saw that there are many ways of doing that actually, right? Bentham, right, was talking about the summation over happiness of people, right? Rawls talks about it. No, that's not social welfare. Social welfare is about how it's actually helping the least well-off person, right? Amartya Sen, in his social welfare function, brings in also an element of inequality, that you want to improve average income or average happiness of everybody, but subject to inequality, that it should not be that some people are very, very happy and many people are very, very sad, right? So that social welfare function is debatable, but Again, the point is that consequentialism will say, well, whatever the definition, if something is increasing the definition, maybe authoritarian techniques are better at increasing social welfare, whatever the definition you want to use, then you should use those, right? So of course there are different views, right? You can argue that, well, this is better, or something else is better. But one of the big gaps in the whole theory is that there has been much less work that exists, that how should these democratic techniques be, right? Examples of these democratic techniques, right? So one thing to, right, that you should start thinking about, and as we go along we'll discover several such examples, but that's something you should now start thinking about, right? That the technologies that we interact with every day, right, what kind of, are they authoritarian or are they democratic? Are they authoritarian in the sense of the management being authoritarian? Are they authoritarian in the sense of imposing authoritarian social structures as opposed to democratic social structures, right? Why? What are the reasons because of which it happens? Okay? And then what could be possible solutions? What could be possible ways in which more democratic technologies are actually built, or more democratic social structures can be imposed, right? So that's something you should now start thinking about, right? Reflecting on, right? I keep sharing all these news articles, which by the way, you also share more, right? And that's the only way we will learn. That's the only way, right? We will really, only when we start applying these principles, we'll really learn, as I've said several times, right? Right. So you should start thinking on those angles, right? Ivan Illich wrote this very nice book called Tools of Conviviality. So conviviality is basically, he defines it as a oneness with nature and others, right? So essentially, right, if you have something which is authoritarian, it restricts your ability to relate with other people. Yeah. So he says that, well, many technologies that we're actually building, especially during the industrial age, or the technologies that we've built, they are by and large authoritarian, and they reduce conviviality. They reduce the ability of humans to relate with nature and with each other. And then he gives many such examples, right? So for example, he talks about cars, right? So if you think about it, right, that you build cars for mobility, right, to move quickly from one place to another. But what has this led to? This has led to many other systems that you've had to build around it, right? So you had cars, so therefore you had to construct roads, right? You had to construct traffic lights. You had to build laws for pedestrian crossings, and then right of way, and so on, right? So basically now you had a technology, but to control that the technology gets used properly, right, and right, doesn't harm others, for example, and so on, right? You had to then continuously start creating many complex structures around it. And now to do these complex structures, therefore, right, it also leads to need for higher education, right, need for more governance, right? Once you start doing that, it leads to power dynamics, right? In some aspects it would need to be authoritarian, in some aspects maybe it can be more open, right? But his point essentially is that the industrial age has by and large produced technologies that require complex social systems to keep them in control. And these social systems are such that they are ultimately reducing our oneness with nature and others, right? So again, it sort of falls short because they don't really talk about, right, how it could have been done alternately, right? Well, one way is one angle of saying is that, well, let's not have cars, let's not have mobility, right? Why do we need to move around so fast? Let's have a slower paced world, right? Now you can raise all sorts of objections to that, right? Right, then a question at another level is that, okay, well, if not cars, then how should you do this mobility, right? Maybe instead of investing research in cars, you should invest more research in communication so that you can do these things remotely, right? This is something we've realized during COVID, that many things are possible to be done remotely, right? There are pros and cons, but well, to a large extent, some things can be done remotely, some things do require a physical presence, right? So you start raising these kinds of questions, or at another level, it could be that, well, okay, you have cars, fine, you need all these complex social systems. Then how should you make sure that these social systems still do not become authoritarian, right? They still have, right, ways for people to influence them, and this is where you get into citizen engagement and urban planning. And so you can think of it at multiple levels, but right, by and large, right, this has been less theorized. There is much less there is a lot that exists on criticism. There is much less that exists on actual solutions. Right. So that's one of the gaps that we continuously keep seeing, and that is essentially right. It also prompts us, right, that this is an open area. It is something that we should think about because we know what's wrong. More and more, if more and more of us work in trying to think how to do something in a better way, I think that would be awesome. So Marx and Engels also, of course, have thought about this. Right. So Marx's viewpoint was that the more mechanization you have, it will reduce inequality in labor. So essentially, you bring in more and more mechanization, then it means that earlier you had. So when Marx was in Marx's context, right, he was looking at what social forces are controlling labor. So one, of course, was capitalists who were exploiting. Right, these capitalists actually replaced an earlier system. On the agrarian side, it was a feudal system. On the side of skilled labor, it was guilds, right? Guilds, GUILD, you would have heard the phrase, right? Guilds are, and even now, right, we have in several industries, there are still associations called guilds, right? So what guilds basically, it's sort of like a cooperative that has monopoly over some particular skills, and they want to retain that monopoly because that is what gives them the power to negotiate. So the guilds were basically dictating the money or the price at which they sell. They were also controlling the supply, right? That to build up these skills, there was an apprenticeship system, right? That you would join a skilled person as an apprentice, learn this trade, and then you could then practice it, right? But the supply could be controlled, right? You could control how many apprentices you would let into the system, right? So by controlling the supply, you could basically artificially control, right, the prices that you demanded. You could create supply shortages and so on, right? So Marx was talking of it from that standpoint that mechanization can actually be good because it can reduce the impact that guilds can have. It can reduce the impact that even capitalists, right? Because the way these systems would work inside factories is that if you had a hierarchical division of labor, then naturally that hierarchy was replicated in the worker relationships. So you had a manager, you had a assembly line manager, then you had some other like a foreman, and then you had some assembly line workers. So each one sort of, there was a hierarchy, and each one was imposing power over the others. So his point was that at that like an asymptotic level, once more and more mechanization sets in, then these relationships would become more and more equal. That could be useful because that would encourage workers to come together, right? So their own internal divisions would disappear and more collective action would then be possible, right? Once the internal divisions between workers disappear, then they might be able to come together and rise against capitalism and move towards communism kind of systems. So that's how Marx was looking at it, right? That this can be useful, right? But Engels was seeing that, well, it may not happen that way, right? Because the more complex technologies, right now, to do this increasing division of labor, you need more complex systems. And basically, he was saying that, and he was actually right? He was more right over here than Marx, that the more complex systems you have, it will lead to more authoritarian ways of life, because then you need somebody to run these systems ultimately, right? So Marx and Engels, of course, work together, right? But there are many pieces of works where they do differ also in their opinions. So you're getting the point, right? Again, another great book that you should read. I don't have its PDF, but maybe it's an old version is available online. There's a new version also, which maybe is available, but you should check, right? It's by Lawrence Lessig. Code is Law. So what this basically, again, right, it builds upon all of these arguments that the technology architecture, right? So you can think of it like code, like source code, right? And the source code is essentially encoding a particular dynamic. So he talks about the internet quite a lot. Now, in the internet, he talks about many aspects. So internet is a distributed system, as you all know. Earlier, it was completely decentralized. Now, it's a distributed system which can be decentralized as well as it can be centralized, and it has become more and more centralized, right? So we know, for example, like cloud computing has led to a lot of centralization, storage is centralized, services are centralized, and that has led to ease of surveillance. So we've seen, we looked at Shoshana Zuboff's point about surveillance capitalism and how also it works hand in hand with what the government wants, what governments want, right? Because it becomes easier to surveil citizens for both governance needs, and then for companies it becomes easier to surveil citizens to do behavior prediction using their data, right? That's one point. But ultimately, he's saying that the code of the internet is such, right, that it allows decentralized, but then it also doesn't guard against a centralized setup, right? And now the economics have basically pushed the internet to be more and more centralized. Then he looks at other things also, like copying of content. So the World Wide Web, as you know, was done by Tim Berners-Lee, and the main motivation that they had was to make knowledge shareable, make knowledge more open, right? And it was with that motivation they said that, well, you should be able to link to other places and discover new things, right? And that's how this whole hyperlinking and the World Wide Web concept actually evolved, right? So the motivation was knowledge sharing, and the internet would allow that, right? But and the internet would also, because of the anonymous design of the internet, right, it was also easy to share, right? That if you were sharing even, let's say, a copyrighted work, it was hard to track you down. But now with more and more centralization, it can't be done, right? Because if you're using Google Drive, for example, for sharing copyrighted content, well, Google knows what you're doing, right? If you're using YouTube, YouTube knows what you're doing, right? So they can check hashes and so on, and that's how they bring down the content. So copyright violation, right? You can say copyright violation in the sense that copyright violation should not be done, and centralized architectures then are making it harder, right? Whereas decentralized ways would still allow that. So it's a different argument as to whether you should have sharing of copyrighted content or not, right? But the point is that the architecture, a decentralized architecture would have made that easier. A centralized architecture makes that harder. Yeah. And then similarly now there are, right, other, right, one big political argument in this whole thing is that copyright has a notion called fair use, that even if something is copyrighted, you still want others to build up from it for knowledge. And that is why you can actually quote, right? Even if something is copyrighted, the law doesn't prevent you from quoting other people as long as you attribute it to them, right? So you can verbatim copy text from one place to another as a quotation without violating copyright, right? That is called fair use. Similarly, reselling is allowed, right? If you have a book, if you buy a book, right, you've paid the copyright owner for the book, right? But then you can also give it to anybody else. You can resell it. It doesn't prevent that, right? Third point with copyright, that who can enforce copyright? Only the copyright owner is allowed to enforce copyright. In the internet, however, that has changed. In the internet, intermediaries like music companies. So music companies may not hold the copyright over the music. The copyright over the music is still held by the artist, but the music company can litigate on their behalf. This is a big change from copyright law. On the internet, intermediaries can enforce copyright, whereas otherwise in the real world, intermediaries cannot, right? Right. And then similarly, we now have methods like digital rights management, right? DRM. So DRM makes it, right, with hardware assistance, it makes it harder for you to copy stuff, right? But which again goes against reselling, right? So the point is, you've bought something, you watched a video, right? You downloaded something, right? You downloaded a music. Now, in the real world, you can resell it to somebody. If you buy a DVD, you can resell it to somebody else. You buy a book, you can resell it to somebody else. But you can't do that on the internet if it is DRM protected. Yeah. So the point that Lawrence Lessig therefore makes, and he uses many different examples, is that you're actually you're encoding the laws, right, in code. And these laws are meant to do certain things. These laws are giving more power to others, to some entities and other people. They're enforcing certain rules, right? Right. So all of these people, right? Langdon Winner included, everybody, right? So the main argument that we're trying to put in over here is that the technology has the way you build the technology, how you architect it, how you code it, you are actually putting in you can change these social relationships because you put that, you encoded that in the technology itself. Yeah. So I hope that that point is clear. Yeah, that earlier in the earlier modules we had essentially looked at technology as an artifact in itself. Now we're looking at the wider context of technology, that you have the technology, what is it doing? And their point is that the same architecture, the whatever you've coded in the technology, that is actually affecting the wider social relationships among people. Some of it you can argue is lawful, some of it is actually changing the law. So it gets into a whole lot of critical thinking and political economy debate about why that is happening, who's making it happen, who has the power to do it, right? But right, that's the main point is that technology has that agency, and you put that agency in the technology through which it shapes these relationships. Yeah. So this is another fantastic paper called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work. Right? So as a counter movement, that okay, well, if technology can impose these relationships, well, how can you write code in the technology? How can you architect technology so that it leads to more democratic kind of relationships, right? So if technology is used to put concentrate power in the hands of a few, well, can you do the opposite? Can you build some other technology which can take power away, right? So this was the cypherpunk movement, and which is basically that led to PGP. So PGP was done by Zimmerman, right? Tor got inspiration from David Chaum, and then later on it was built by right several people, including not able to remember the names, right? You all know about WikiLeaks, even Bitcoin for that matter, right? So all these systems are essentially challenging authority, right? They are alternate technology systems that have been built, where the nature of the technology itself is such that it's aimed to put more power in the hands of the people, as opposed to other technologies which are putting more power in the hands of a few. So they say that, well, encryption can be a tool to empower ordinary people, right? Encryption need not be a tool to empower, right, put more power in the hands of Google or Facebook and so on, right? But we can build technology so that encryption can also be a tool for empowering ordinary people, right? So we know about differential privacy, right? And they say that, well, so what Roger Bay says is that the problem with differential privacy is that it paints the database owner as a good guy, right? And users querying it as the adversary. Yeah. So we've seen this with differential privacy, right? That it's you add noise to the data so that anybody who's querying it is not able to get the real thing, and the database owner is therefore the good guy, right? The person that wants to protect all of this, right? But what it doesn't ask, right? What it doesn't point out is that what if this database owner is not actually the good guy, right? Right. So you're protecting differential privacy, but what if there are data breaches which happen? What if this good guy is leaking data, selling data behind your back? Yeah, right. So on the surface, they'll say we have differential privacy, right? Nobody can get access, but on the back end, right? Just poor policies. So you know about. So have any of you seen this serial Jamtara on Netflix? Right, you should. It's pretty cool. So this thing came out. The controversy erupted. Rather, the revelation happened a couple of years back. So Jamtara is a poor district in Jharkhand. It's become a hub of cybercrime, and basically this crime is essentially phishing, right? So they would call somebody and they would say, well, you won a lottery and share, right? We will transfer money to you, right? You will get an OTP on your phone, send it back to us, or right, things like that. Or give us a debit card number, things like that. Now people don't know and they share this information, and these kids are able to, and it's literally kids, right? It's literally like youth who are educated, they know mobile phones and stuff, don't have jobs, and they're doing all this. They're able to do all this phishing now, but ultimately they need some data. They need to know some information that what are the banks, who has an account in which bank, what are their phone numbers, all of that. How do they get that data? They just go to the bank branch, pay some money to the bank, right? People working at the bank and get this data. It's just as simple as that, right? That's your data breach, right? Right? Who will come to know, right? Right? Because these are like small bank branches in remote areas. Now, of course, cyber crime is becoming tight, right? There's more laws and stuff coming up, but even then it's very hard to catch. So it's a nice serial. You should watch it. I mean, it's entertaining in general. Plus, you'll learn how this phishing thing happens. But that's the data breach you're talking about, right? It's just very straightforward. It's there. The data is there with somebody, right? But that is something which is not presented, right? So what therefore Rogers argues is that, well, you should look at it critically as well. That it's not just about, right, differential privacy solving one kind of a problem, but it's not solving some right, one of the bigger issues, right, of data breaches as such. That requires more things, right? Maybe the data should be encrypted as well. If it is encrypted, then how do you query it? Then you need to think about homomorphic encryption. Now, homomorphic encryption, again, he says that it's very difficult. It's not been solved, right? With differential privacy, you're able to do histogram, CDF, PDF like queries. You're able to do clustering queries. You're able to do regressions, machine learning on the data. But with homomorphic encryption, we're still very far away, right? Plus, right, also raises questions, right? That is, right, why is this data being stored? Are any minimalistic principles being followed, right? That this data, once it is available, it will lead to public good. People are not asking those questions. So it's right. So it's how debate also gets deflected. Same with another, right? So there's something called identity-based encryption, right? So you know about public-private key cryptography, and with regular RSA public-private key, right? Anybody can generate their private-public key pair, right? So you just have a tool, SSH key gen, right? You can generate your public-private key pair on your own. You make your public, you put your public key on your web page, you keep your private key with you, and you can do PGP. Yeah. Then this aspect about identity-based encryption came in, which said that, well, public key, you have to put it on your web page, and somebody has to go to your web page, know that, okay, be convinced that, okay, this is really your web page, and then they will get your public key, because otherwise maybe somebody else could be masquerading your web page and put up a different public key, and they'll be able to launch attacks. So identity-based encryption said that, well, what if your email address itself was your public key? Yeah. So that will be really cool, because then nobody needs to actually go to your web page to, right, or to use third-party certificates to make sure that your public key is actually your public key. Yeah. So if you don't understand this, you should quickly read up on certificates, right? What are certificates? Third-party certificates, right? So these are just agencies that certify your public key, that this is actually your public key. They will verify your address, you have to give an address proof and so on, and then they send you the public key, or you can generate it yourself and they can sign it for you. Yeah, so that's how signatures work, right? Which relies on some entity that is authorizing your public key. Yeah. So identity-based encryption said that, well, let's a complicated system. Let's what if just your email address could be a public key, and they built the system. So given the email address, they're able to generate a private key, and this entity which generates the private key is called the private key generator. So great, fantastic paper, right? And in fact, done by very, very reputed people, founders pretty much of cryptography. I think this was done by Dan Boneh, right? Is one of the key people in crypto, right? But Rogers' argument to this is that what it doesn't actually say is that who is this private key generator? That guy actually knows your public key and your private key, so that guy can actually decrypt whatever they want. You're ultimately you've not solved the problem. Right? I mean, in at least the earlier regular RSA public key cryptography, you didn't have to divulge your private key. You just needed somebody to sign your public key for you, right? They didn't have your private key. Your private key was with you. Only you could decrypt your stuff. But with IB, you've actually given off your private key to somebody. Somebody knows your private key. So he says that, well, why would you use such a thing? Just for ease of use, you're actually giving up your privacy. So, right, so he basically says that, well, you should regard everything as suspect and dialectical. Think about what you're doing, right? So think about the politics. Choose your problems, right? So choose your problems, right? You do your research, you should do anti-surveillance research. Your surveillance is bad, right? Just blanket bad. Surveillance is bad. You want to spend your time, you're spending, right, hours and hours, days, years, decades doing research, right? You ultimately want this research to lead to something. So choose your problems well. Be introspective about why you're working on the problems you are, right? So it's a very, very nice paper that you should read. This is not the only thing he talks about, right? This is about crypto, but more broadly, he talks about why technologists need to be more political. and he gives many examples also, right? Similar things, right? That I've actually been using some of parts from his paper, right? In many places that we've looked at. So you get this picture, right? You get the big picture. Now, is there any unifying way to think about all this, right? What's actually happening? This is an area which I feel is not actively developed. And what helped me is basically to think of it in terms of power. And this is something, right? So in this book that I've been trying to write, I have a chapter 6, that you can go through, right? Chapter 6 talks about modeling of power relationships. Because I think a lot of it, right, if you need to understand it through some common framework, through a common theory, then power theories about power are probably giving you that lens. So again, I might be wrong, but that's at least how. So far, I've not found exceptions in the sense that we're able to relate some all of these, right, in some way or the other to power. So if you leave technology aside for a minute, right? So there are different ways to think about power, different levels, so to say, in which people think about power. So one is that you get power through the resources you command. These resources could be things like expertise, credibility, money, right? If you have money, you can do certain things. Somebody who doesn't have money, they can't, right? If you have knowledge, you can do certain things. Somebody who doesn't have knowledge, they'll be dependent upon you to help you do all that, right? Right. So power is basically the ability to influence decisions, right? And at one level, at the basic level, those who have resources are able to influence decisions of others. Those who don't have these resources are not able to influence the decisions. Yeah. Another level is that of rules. That the way the rules are laid down, rules might favor certain kinds of outcomes. So the rules are the ones which are actually imposing different power relationships among people, right? At level one, it is who has the resources, they are able to influence decisions. Level two is certain rules might directly be influencing certain relationships. Level three, who is actually making these rules? Those who have the power to make the rules, right, are therefore the ones who are actually doing it, right? And then how do they get the power? How do they get the power to make rules, right? So this is where it gets into theories about cultural hegemony, right? That somebody has the power to make rules. Is anybody challenging? Is anybody challenging them? Right? Are grievances being lodged against them? Why, right, are demands being made, or are there conflicts against some of these entrenched power structures? Is resistance occurring, right? And then if not, then why, right? So here the key thinker is an Italian, Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci was around during the World War and a bit after that. So he wrote this very famous, right, the prison notebooks. So over 1,000 pages. So he was imprisoned, and over 1,000 pages that he wrote, which are, right, called the prison notebooks, about basically the point that he was trying to make. He was trying to understand how are these hegemonic structures tolerated by people, right? That how are they legitimized? Why do people not rise and protest against them, right? So he basically talks about how the media, for example, the culture, norms in the culture, all of these are actually used as tools, as tools to impose this hegemony. Right? So you're essentially managing the meaning, right? You manage the meaning, and people might not really question that, right? So we look at more examples, but you can start thinking, right? That let's say even in technology, right? So we've looked at search ranking, for example, right? So let's just use that example, right? So in search ranking, we know that, well, popularity is seen as a resource, right? Right. So if you think of popularity as a resource, then pages which are more popular are the ones which are getting ranked higher, right? At the level of rules, you have that. Well, what rule is making that actually possible? What rule is making it possible that those pages which are more popular are ranked higher, right? So you get into, right, the algorithm, like PageRank itself. Then you ask that who's actually made this rule, right? Who actually put this rule in place? Well, you say Google put this rule in place, and then you start asking that why is nobody protesting against it, right? Why is nobody protesting that it is very hard for new pages to get discovered and easy for old things to just entrench themselves, right? So in the same way, you can think about, let's say, the market structure, yeah, non-technology, right? In the market, right? Those who have more market power, right? So now, how do you get market power? Well, if you're the only monopoly, right, you can control the wages that you pay to your workers, or you can control the prices that you're giving to your customers, because there's little competition. Yeah. So you're getting this because of the existing resources that you already have, the capital that you have, and so on. Yeah. And what rules are making it possible? So what rules are making it possible for monopolies to exist or for you to keep accumulating? Right? Well, these are the rules of capitalism. Yeah. So there might be anti-monopoly laws to counter some of that, but ultimately it's the rules of capitalism which encourage accumulation. If you're able to make a profit, you keep that profit. And then now that you have a profit, you can undercut prices. Yeah, you undercut prices, you gain market share because your competitors cannot undercut prices. They have not made as much of a profit. So the moment you get ahead, the profit, the accumulation is making it easier for you to get more and more ahead. Right? You have the rich get richer phenomena, same like in PageRank. Right? You in PageRank, what was happening? You were more popular and you could get more and more popular because of the PageRank algorithm. Here, the market mechanism is allowing that. The market mechanism says it's a free market, anybody can compete. But what it doesn't say is that there is an accumulation, right? The market is actually working in a capitalist environment. The market is not working in some kind of a communist or socialist environment. The market is working in a capitalist environment, which allows accumulation. You make a profit, right? Where does this profit come from? This profit, as we've seen, comes from surplus value that you extract from labor. Yeah, people make stuff for you, and you're able to sell it at a higher price. That's a surplus value. You get the profit, and that you accumulate that profit. That profit is yours. You can choose to do what you want to do with it. Yeah, right. So you would one way is that you want to gain monopoly. You reinvest that profit. You undercut prices. This is what Amazon does. Do you know how much profit Amazon makes? Do you know how much it pays in taxes? Anybody, right? You've been silent so far. Please, somebody, please speak up. Do you know how much profit Amazon makes? How much does Amazon pay in taxes? Sorry? See that again?
Sir, I just want to say that I don't know about the Amazon, but I know about the Airbnb, and they don't pay any taxes. So that was the case I listened a couple of years before. So
Yeah.
they were earning a lot, but they were not paying in terms of the taxes to the US government.
Yeah, Amazon's profit is zero. Can you believe it? I mean, it is ridiculous. Amazon, right? Its profit is zero. I mean, you would laugh. How is it possible? But that's what it is. Why, right? I mean, on the one hand, you'll say it is awesome, right? It's such a Jeff Bezos is the world's greatest genius. Because what are they doing? They're reinvesting all their profit. They're reinvesting all their profit for expansion. Right? So anyway, coming back to what we're saying, right? The rule which is allowing that is that it allows accumulation. It allows the companies to reinvest their profit for expansion, and they're able to eat up all competition. Right? That's basically what it is. Right? Then you say, well, who's making all these rules? Why is nobody protesting against it? Yeah. So that's where hegemony becomes important, right? You can think of it in terms of whatever, right? Right wing propaganda, all of that, right? But it's the same structure, right? Of power, right? That power operating at multiple levels. Level one, resources. Who has the resources to influence the outcomes? Level two, what rules are making that possible? What rules are making it possible that these resources are influencing the outcomes? Level three, who is making those rules? Why are they able to make these rules? Why are they able to get away with these rules? Why is nobody protesting against these rules? Yeah, that's hegemony, right? That is right. That's ideological hegemony, right? There is an ideology, right? That these rules are what they should be. These are the rules that we want to live by, right? It's an ideology, right? Capitalism is has become an ideology, right? That this is what we want to live by. Nobody's protesting against it. Why? Because we just it's just become ingrained. This is the way to do stuff. When anything becomes ingrained, it becomes an ideology. Yeah, that's what it means. What does an ideology mean? Ideology means that nobody's come and proven mathematically to you that, well, this is the thing to do. It's just something you believe in. Yeah, everybody believes in, and therefore resistance is less. Yeah. So that's the right. That's the whole idea. Foucault went beyond that, right? Foucault said that if this is the case, right, ideology therefore means knowledge in some sense, right? I mean, more knowledge can counter ideology, right? Therefore, power is about control over knowledge. Yeah, the real power is in control of knowledge. So then he talks about, right, institutions that control knowledge, like schools, democracies, right? Democracy, as we know, right, is a great tool for learning if it is done in the right way, right? Deliberative democracy, we discussed in the earlier classes, it helps you know opinions, facts of life about other people. Yeah, and you learn through it. You learn why they are not happy with some things, and then, well, you get into trying to get to a consensus and so on. So ultimately, it's about knowledge, right? Right. So Foucault then basically says that power is about control over knowledge. Yeah, but then he also says that when you're talking about control over knowledge, control over meaning, you're actually saying, yeah, you're right. You're actually defining it, and therefore he also says that, well, there can be counter power movements, right? Power is everywhere. Today, power might be entrenched with some people, but it is always possible that there can be pockets from where new knowledge can emerge and which can challenge these counterpowers. Yeah. So now whether that happens, to what extent will these counterpowers be successful, we don't know. But Foucault's argument is that the power is about control over knowledge, and knowledge can emerge in new ways, right? So he's basically trying to build that argument that, right, things can change, things will always change, basically. So this particular paper, it's there. I like this paper because it explains this in a nice way. It looks at it more, not at all from a technology or a democracy context, but just in organizations. And it's the same thing, right? First dimension of power is over resources. Second dimension is over decision-making processes. Third dimension is over management of meaning. Fourth dimension is that power is everywhere. There can be local struggles that can come up. So it looks at it from within organizations, right? Within organizations also you have the same thing, right? Like within organizations, right? Companies, for example, you would say that I'm giving power to the employees. They can raise issues. I'm empowering employees. So this is a lingo that you hear so much in companies, right? That we have a very open culture. Anybody can give their ideas. Anybody can talk about what they don't like and so on. But are they really able to? Right. So the business management literature, for example, if you do an MBA, right, you will be told you should give power to everybody, right? But actually it may not happen, right? For example, empowerment can be used as a tool to motivate employees to achieve organizational goals, right? But actually, right, it may not be very easy, because when you're saying something, it means that it's your manager will come to know, right? There's less anonymity, right? And therefore you will always be reserved in what you say. So you might, right, on the surface people may say that they've given power to employees, but maybe it's not like that. Then you think about, well, how about you have I have it somewhere, 360-degree appraisals, right? We'll stumble upon it. It's somewhere in the slides, right? But just to complete the context, so right, so you say you can have anonymous submissions, right, and so on. But then there's other factors also, because the same, right, you also use the same mechanisms for performance appraisals in companies and so on. So ultimately the point is that it's difficult, right? It's difficult really to put in systems, right, in organizations also, that help equate power, right? But yeah, but yeah, so the point therefore is that you can look at it from within organizations, that who can influence decisions, or can they really influence decisions, right? Or is it just like an artificial thing? Similarly, within democracies, you talk about, right, who's made these rules in the first place. And here we looked at C. Wright Mills, who was a US American sociologist, So he wrote this book called The Power Elite, right? And he talks about how big companies, politicians, celebrities, right? How they are actually connected together. It's a nexus, and how they're able to shape rules of society so that their wealth and their power remains entrenched, right? So things like taxation, right? Why are taxes so low, right? Why did India abolish wealth taxation? It was there, now it's not there. Capital gains tax, right? It's been reduced, right? So right, and on the other hand, we have people going hungry, right? Not enough funds for Narega, not enough funds for rations distribution, and so on, right? So where do you get these funds? Well, you get it through taxation, but right, who's shaping these rules, right? So essentially, I mean, even in democracy, you say that, well, democracy also, if it's not done properly, it leads to this creation of this power elite, right? The companies are the ones who fund the politicians, so there ends up being a quid pro quo. Rules are inevitably shaped in favor of the rich, the oligarchs, plutocrats, right? So there are all these things. Mass media again can be under control. Can citizens still rise though? So Ambedkar and critical theory, right? They all talk about empowerment as a process through which people and organizations gain mastery and counter existing power relations that result in the domination of subordinate groups, right? That how can you question all of this? How can you rise against it, right? So Ambedkar's famous thing, right? Educate, agitate, organize, right? So why is it all important? Educate is about, right? You come to know, right? Knowledge, right? That knowledge about who has the power, right? How can you do something else? Because power is really about control over knowledge, right? So you need to educate, you need to agitate, and then you need to get organized, right? You can't just agitate, right? But only when you get organized can you actually overcome these entrenched power structures. Yeah. So Foucault basically says that, well, it is possible to organize, right? It is possible for this pipeline to get created, for people to gain new knowledge, to agitate and to organize. That's what Foucault is saying ultimately. So anyway, so the point is that this structure of thinking about power in at least these three levels, it is very useful. That's what I found to be quite useful to think about when we talk about technology from a system lens, right? That is the technology, for example, in the hands of those who have some resources, or it favors certain things, right? Then who put in these rules in the first place, and why are they being challenged or not being challenged? Yeah. So that's what, right? Overall, we'll see that this becomes a useful way. At least I found it to be useful to think of it in this way. So then we look at a whole bunch of case studies, right? So we've looked at Uber, for example, and this is a very popular paper which talks about algorithmic control over the drivers, right? Of how Uber is able to use algorithms to control drivers, right? So the question is that, are Uber drivers really free agents, right? So you know that drivers are, right? So Uber, Zomato, everybody calls them partners, delivery partners. What does it mean? It means that they're not actually employees. They're contractors. They are free agents. They can do what they want. They have chosen to deliver food, drive cars, right? They're entrepreneurs in themselves. And what is Uber doing, or what is Zomato doing, is just a matching application. It is only taking customers and matching it with the drivers, and it is just playing that matching role, right? So essentially, they say that we only provide leads to the drivers. We only provide leads to our partners. After that, they choose what they want to do, right? Our job is only to connect and to be that market entity, right? Now, well, is that true? Right, so the big debate, and in fact, so I've been sharing articles. There have been many judgments these days that drivers and these delivery partners are not contractors. They cannot be considered as contractors. They should actually be considered as employees. Yeah. So in the Europe especially, there have been many legislations just recently, right, in Netherlands, UK, where the judgments have been in favor of the workers, that, right, you're not just a contractor, right? Because there are many different. Because if you're a worker, if you're an employee, it's the responsibility of the company to provide you with social security, right? Things like provident fund, things like health insurance, because there are so many laws around that, which have emerged also largely through worker movements, through labor movements. But if you're just a contractor, then it's on you, right? It's up to you. You want social security or you want to buy your health insurance, well, you buy it. It's not our responsibility to do anything about it. Yeah, it's not responsible for the employer to do anything about it, right? So the question is therefore that are Uber drivers, should they be considered as free agents or should they be considered as workers? So what this paper does is something very, very cool. It basically shows that actually they are under algorithmic control and these algorithms are operated by Uber. So effectively they are working under Uber's control. Yeah. So and they give many examples. So for example, drivers have 15 seconds to accept, reject a ride, but no parameters to decide, no transparency in allocation decisions. Yeah. So right, so very little independence of freedom over there. They're not shown the destination. They can't decide it. They have no basis on what to decide on what to make the decisions. There are minimum fares. Leave drivers at a loss. I don't remember what this is. We'll have to go back to the paper. Return of lost items, right? So if somebody leaves their bag in the car, the drivers have to return it, but they don't get any money for it, right? They're still paying the fuel cost, but they don't, right? And then of course there are penalties if there is deviation, right? So if you cancel, if you reject a ride, ultimately there are penalties, right? So basically, right, argument that no, they're not free agents, right? The algorithm is imposing control. The algorithm is telling them what is acceptable, what is not acceptable behavior. So they're not like just an arbitrary entrepreneur, right? Who can choose on their own free will. They have to follow these rules. Bureaucratic dispute resolution. So if drivers have a problem, right, there's no human interface to talk to. The company looks at log data to resolve disputes. Responses are templatized. Companies that don't have a nuanced understanding of the context or challenges of work. Right, so many things can happen, right? Maybe the customer is abusive. Maybe the customer started creating a ruckus that no, you stop here. I want to buy a cigarette or do this, do that, right? So there's very little power in the hands of the drivers, and all of this, any dispute resolution is also after the fact, after it has actually happened. So, right, so if drivers are mere consumers of a lead generation application, which is what Uber claims, then nudging is just another form of information advertising. Nudging meaning search pricing, for example, where the company might nudge the drivers, right? That why don't you go to this location? There is search pricing over there. Or why don't you come online? Because they're just about to hit into a search pricing. So this is a nudging, right? Which they can give as a lead generation application. But if the nudging is coming from an employer which has strong control and is linked with metrics, performance, disqualification, then you're part of a managed labor force, right? You're part of a managed. You're an employee. Then you're not really a contractor. Yeah. So they give all these examples. Control is imposed through metrics. There's a minimum rating that has to be maintained. Supervision is delegated to riders, right? So riders are given more power because they can rate drivers. So that's why, right, with Zomato and everybody, we always have them telling us, right, please rating de dijiye, rating de dijiye. Why is all that, right? Because, right, so for example, right, 4.6 is the minimum rating. If the rating drops below 4.6, right, they're dismissed. And then problems are reported that, well, your city knowledge is low or your professionalism was not nice and so on, right? So again, the point being, this is not what you would ask from an independent contractor. You would ask this from an employee. Yeah. With search pricing, right? Search pricing is used to get drivers to do certain things, but then these predictions are also often wrong and no explanations are given, right? There's no penalties also, that if you did search pricing, somebody went out, they spent their gas, petrol to get to a particular location, but they did not get any rides, or that whatever promise had been made did not come about. There's no protest on that, right? I mean there's no negative penalties on that, right? So here again, right? So then that it's not there's no accountability therefore on this nudge, right? So again, right, it's an argument that there's little management, there's little worker control. So there is a test in the US. They came up with a test called the ABC test. Not for this, the test has been around, which basically is a test to decide whether somebody should be a contract worker or somebody should actually be can claim that they are a regular employee. Yeah. So there are three things. that the worker should be free from control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work. Okay, right? So if the hiring entity can question the performance of the work, you're more likely that you should be an employee. The worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. Yeah. So big problem, right? Even in India. So in factories, for example, you may have heard about a lot of what's called casualization of labor, or just Google it. Casualization of labor in like garment factories, automobile factories, right, and so on. This casualization of labor, what is it saying? That there are very few permanent workers, very few regular workers, but the company employs people on a daily wage basis to do the work, right? So the law actually says that you can't do that. If these temporary hires are doing the same work as a regular employee, you should not be hiring them as temporary workers. You should be hiring them as regular employees. Right? So that's your second check. Third, the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade. So the worker is doing something else. But if that is of the same nature as that involved in the work, then again, right, you're more likely to be a worker than a contractor. So this is called the ABC test, right? Now, if you apply this, right, so basically this ABC test was applied, and right, arguments like which are made in this paper were basically used. California, for example, came up with something what they call the AB5 bill, which basically said that drivers should actually be workers of companies, not contractors. But I don't understand the legal stuff, of course, very well in the US. But it seems that in the US, it is possible for anybody to conduct a referendum, right? A public poll to question laws, right? So in India, probably the equivalent is a PIL. Over there, you can do these campaigns, and so Uber and Lyft and others, they ran a very public and very heavily funded campaign, which basically questioned the AB5 bill, which basically said that, and it was very interesting, right? Why it happened, right? Largely, right? I mean, the citizens basically said that, well, drivers should be contractors, right? Regular people in California, they said that drivers should be contractors. Of course, it was a campaign by Uber, so it's possible that there may have been a lot of targeting in the campaign. The campaign may have been crafted with a particular agenda. This is something that we can read more about of why it happened. But basically, the referendum said that when actually the AB5 bill should be questioned. It is better that workers should be contractors in Uber. I mean, ride-sharing companies. Then there were other judgments that were passed which said that this proposition is actually unconstitutional, right? Again, arguing based on the ABC test and so on, that it is unconstitutional to consider drivers as so. So the debate is still open, right? The point is that debate is still open, and different countries will react in different ways. Right, in the US, the politics would be very different from the politics in the UK, or politics in Netherlands, or politics in Sweden. Right, very different things. In Germany, for example, Uber has to hire. Germany says that you have to hire them as employees. In Germany, labor unions are very strong, and that's how it works, right? In the US, they're weaker, and you're going through this whole stuff, right? In the UK, laws have, right now, judgments have been passed that drivers should be workers, right? So different countries are shaping these laws differently, right? So this is the gig economy is one of those very interesting spaces that where the laws are catching up and people are debating, right? But again, you see the political economy operating over here, yeah, right? So that's one example. Another, right, you should read this also, Uber's Grey Ball program of how they evade scrutiny, right? So this is where to check for working conditions of drivers and so on, government officials can pretend to be customers and try to get Uber rides, and then they observe what's happening. And Uber actually made a program through which they collected a database of government officials. They built a database of phone numbers of government officials, so that if these officials are the ones requesting for cabs or whatever, then they got some kind of a special treatment. So this is all there. I mean, it's all in the public domain that these things have happened. So this is an example, just like lobbying, just like companies engage in lobbying, companies also try to dupe authorities. Yeah. So this is another very interesting initiative called the Fair Work platform, which comes under the broader ambit of something called social audit or community-based monitoring. So here what they do is they collect data from drivers. They've done it in India and in Africa, in South Africa. So they collected data from drivers and ranked them on different metrics. Like, do you have a wage contract in place or not? Are you getting minimum wages, equivalent of minimum wages or not? Are you overworked? Right, and so on. There's lots of different parameters on which they then produce a ranking. And then they've released two rankings so far, I think, 2019 and 2020. So they do these rankings of the sort that Flipkart has better working conditions than Dunzo, than Big Basket, Zomato, and so on, right? So this is something we look at it in more detail later, right? But when you talk about power, right? So the point that we'll get to is that when you talk about power, that power is entrenched with somebody. In this case, it's entrenched with Uber or these ride-sharing companies and how they control workers. You need mechanisms to counter that. You need mechanisms of checks and balances. So social audit is one such mechanism, right? Where you collect data and then you make that data publicly available. So now customers also know that which of their companies is better, which of these companies has better working conditions than others. And then you might, right, consumer ethics might prompt you to, I mean, in this case, for example, use Zomato instead of Uber Eats. Now, of course, Uber Eats has been bought, I think, by Zomato only, right? But that's the idea, sort of the social audit. And plus, of course, I mean, then it becomes ways for you to question the laws also, right? But lots of stuff happening in this space. Right. In the same way, we know about Aadhaar. We've talked about Aadhaar, digital identity. So Ritika Khera over here, and then me and our team at Gramvani, we've also done a lot of work in this space. Right. That who, for example, has Aadhaar-based biometric authentication really empowered, right? ABA, Aadhaar-based biometric authentication, right? That's the short form, right? So I'm sure you know what that means, right? So when it comes to like getting ration from PDS and so on, right? Right. So it's not really right. So we have all of these stories, right? A lot of it was collected during the lockdown, and we've written some very detailed reports on this also. Right. So young girl says my parents are stranded in Delhi, right? Migrant workers who moved to Delhi, but the dealer does not accept my authentication to give ration. The dealer knows me, dealer is on the same community as me, the ration dealer, but right now because there's a technology in place, right? They don't, right? So things how the technology has sort of taken power away from, in this case, right, the people who are managing, right, unable to displace these entrenched power holders. That biometric authentication is done, but ration is not given. Complaint to Pradhan, but still missed ration, but still haven't gotten my ration for April. Right. So again, right, because it's difficult to protest against ration dealers and so on, right? There's mafia things also involved depending on different places, right? Plus that person has control ultimately, right? They can deny because, right, maybe they can make excuses about what technology exists, the technology is not working, or this is not happening, or I've run out of ration and so on. Right, you have very little power to protest against them. So how do you counter it? Right, you need grievance redressal mechanisms, you need empowerment, you need the people to be confident to make a complaint, right? But now you can think about wider social issues because of which that may not happen, right? Introduces new intermediaries also, right? I'm unable to receive money under PM Kisan because of spellings in my Aadhaar card. Name does not match my name in other documents, and therefore that the automatic check at the banking end is now failing, right? Aadhaar card is linked to somebody else's bank account, right? Data entry error, right? How do all of these data entries get made? You go to a RTPS, right to public services RTPS counter, or sometimes they might set up camps in villages, right? So you go and give your documents to the patwari or whoever is setting up the camps, and then that some other person is entering data into a backend, right? It's a digitization data entry process. Mistakes happen, right? Aadhaar card is linked to somebody else's bank account. Well, what do you do? Money is going into somebody else's account, or maybe it's being denied if there's a name check on us on the name. Bank cashier is refusing cash withdrawal unless I pay 350 rupees to activate my account. Right? My account got deactivated because I didn't use it. Why didn't I use it? Well, the bank is so far away. And whenever I go to a bank, sometimes the internet is not working, this and that. So I don't use my bank account. But now that the government has made a transfer because of the pandemic, the government made these transfers. I want to withdraw money from the account. I need money. I'm out of jobs. So I go to the bank account, but then they're asking me for more money to activate the bank account, even though they should not be. Yeah. So there are all of these different things which happen that once you do introduce the technology, right, it's changing the social relationships, right? Maybe new intermediaries would be introduced, right? Maybe the design may not be able to displace those who are already entrenched, who already have the power, right? So it becomes easy for the ration dealers, for example, to make excuses, right? One design modification that we say that should be brought in, that they should not just be able to unilaterally say that काम नहीं कर रहा है system. At the point of service, let's say they have to record a message. They have to record a message that this time पे ये काम नहीं कर रहा है, right? I think even if you put that mechanism out there, and which is then auditable, which is then publicly available, I think that can be very powerful, because then the ration dealer, you're essentially taking power away from them, right? You're actually then saying that, well, you have to put yourself, you have to clearly say that it's not working, and that then becomes auditable, because then you can actually check that, well, was the system down at that point or not, or what other problem happened, right? So there are many such things, right? Therefore, right, which again talk about who is the technology really empowering, right? And who is it disempowering, or how is it changing the relationships? Are new intermediaries coming into the picture because of the technology? So just like the Uber example, right, digital identity systems and how they are being used, right? This is another very important area that requires a lot of attention, because very often these things, right, Uber, right, so these things are being pushed by companies for profit. Why are these things being pushed by the government? These things are being pushed by the government for, in theory, they're being done to prevent identity fraud, that people don't get, people who don't deserve ration don't get it, right? You want to minimize false negatives, right? That people, right, who don't deserve it, they should not get it, right? But what it is leading to is very high false positives, right? That people are actually being excluded. People who should be who should be able to get it, are not getting it. Yeah. So these are, right. So it's debatable as to, right, why are these systems being pushed in the way they are being pushed. Then you again talk about the political economy, that because, right, once you have Aadhaar and then the whole financial technology built around it for making borrowings easier and so on, right? So there are many commercial interests also which can benefit once these systems are prevalent, right? So the point is that systems can be useful, they can be efficient, but then have you examined them properly? Have you made sure that those who are being empowered, there are checks and balances being put in place? Or those who are being disempowered have a means of getting their agency back, right? If it's done without these things, it's not right. Yeah, it's just as simple as that. Cool. So we'll continue on this. There's a bunch of more examples that I'll bring up, Narega, Bhumi, and we'll go on. Later on, we'll do a look at, right, some thoughts on modeling of power. Most of it is just coming from what I've been trying to do. Lots more to be done. And then similarly, next time, one question we'll see is that, well, we've normally seen that to solve many of these things, transparency can help, right? But can transparency really, right? Under what circumstances will it actually help or not? Right, so that also is questionable. Yeah.